actually at Fox News. I had interned there for about a year, and then I worked on their international desk. And after that, I moved on to CNN. I started in business news for their financial channel, and I've moved around. I've done politics, I've done national security coverage, and then I've eventually ended up in the job I'm in today.
Okay. So when you came to CNN the first time, when you came to CNN, what were you doing? What type of jobs?
Yeah, I started at the very bottom, production assistant, running scripts, doing basic research, whatever anyone needed, I was willing to do to move up the ladder, frankly. I've done field producing, which is I've gone out with reporters and camera crews in the field to do stories, to cover events. I've run what they call desk coverage, which is I've run assignment desks, making decisions on sending out crews and such. I ran the 2004 CNN political coverage for that election, John Kerry, excuse me, that election. And then I eventually moved to Washington, where I started just doing general news. And then I was moved on to run Pentagon coverage. I then formulated a national security team, which includes, as you've heard from Katie, Bo, and Alex, State Department coverage, which is diplomacy, Pentagon, which is covering our US military, intelligence, we've added in cybersecurity. So all these matters that the US government does, and also how they operate around the world. After that, I was promoted and I started to, as a VP, I ran, and I believe that was a job I had when this story ran, and I was in charge of coverage for the Justice team, which is coverage of Supreme Court, the Justice Department, the FBI, and law enforcement, as well as court cases and national security, and also enterprise, which is a subject that's come up here as well. And since then, I've moved to my current job, which is I'm responsible for all the coverage in Washington. So it's everything I just described, as well as the White House and Capitol Hill. I also oversee all of CNN investigations.
Okay. In terms of the people that the jury have heard testify, Mr. Marquardt, Ms. Lillis, and some of the other people, where do you sit in terms of that organization?
Right. So my responsibility is to be in charge of all of those reporters. They have main editors, like you've heard the name Mike Callahan, he runs national security. There are people like that for every topic. There are also editors like Tom Lumley who work with them. But my job is really from above to prioritize what stories are we covering, when are we covering them, how are we covering them, to work with the different shows. CNN has a lot of different shows to figure out where stories are going. It's really a top-level management approach to news and figuring out what is our priority, what is our strategy. I also weigh in on whether I think stories are ready to go. There's enough reporting there, working with our triad. So it's a variety of things, as well as managing everyone that's under me.
So let me start with some basics, some things that we haven't really talked about in this trial. How do stories come about? Where does a story get its start?
They come about in different ways. Sorry. One is what Katie Bo was saying. The reporter has questions about things that are happening and sees what might be an interesting way to tell a story to our audience that they might learn more about that story. There are events that happen and we just cover those. And then there are more investigative efforts where we might be tipped to things, where we might learn about things that we delve into that might expose things, show us wrongdoing. We spend a lot of time wanting to hold government accountable for the actions they're taking. So there are a lot of different areas that stories can emanate from.
Let's talk about kind of the spectrum. On one end, Katie Bo Lillis talked a little bit about the New Orleans, and maybe that was Emma Lacey Gordo, talked about the New Orleans shooting.
Right.
Would covering that be kind of like breaking news?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, on any given day, there are events happening and news that are happening that don't start with us, right? Like today, I think there are about 6 in Washington. There are about 6 different hearings to try to confirm some of President Trump's nominees to be various cabinet officials. We're going to cover those. They're happening. Things are going to be said. We're going to do stories on them. We're going to say what happened. At the same time, there are other stories that we're developing that haven't that if we don't tell them, maybe no one's going to tell them. It's not just that they're happening out there, but we've developed them. Those are more what we call the enterprise stuff.
Check.
More time. They take reporting. They take storytelling. Nominees to be
Building your online business? Go to Wix.com and set up your store on a single integrated platform.
There are other stories that we're developing.
Check.
And it's a much more introspective way of looking at it.
So the stories that this jury's seeing, the TV segment and the article, where do those kind of fit in the spectrum besides from kind of day-to-day news to the investigative at the other end of the spectrum?
So it's in the enterprise space, right? I mean, but it was playing off news that was happening on any given day. I bet if we went back to November of that year, there was a lot of Afghanistan events happening every single day. From those events, we started asking questions that would help, tell more story and help explain what was going on and what was the impact of those horrible events when the Taliban took over and there was all that chaos. So this is one of those stories, right? Alex had an inkling of he wanted to look more into how Afghans that weren't just getting on government planes or didn't have easy way out, how were they dealing with trying to get out? There was a lot of struggle on that. And what were they confronting as they tried to navigate their way through what was going on in Afghanistan and figure out a way to get out of there?
Mr. Demesa, if we could do a limited production of Defense Exhibit 71. And so, Mr. Levine, do you see this email between yourself, Mr. Marquardt, Mr. Callahan, and Matt Phillips?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd move for admission of DX 71.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, Defense 71 submitted.
And may I publish?
You may.
Thank you. So I'm looking at first at the bottom email from Mr. Marquardt, where he talks about the extortion of desperate Afghans. And the subject is pitches. What are we looking at?
Right. So, Alex, every single reporter is pitching stories. They all want to do stories. They're all looking for stories. Alex has been doing a series of stories about people getting out of Afghanistan. This is something he'd spent some time doing some initial reporting on. And he felt he had enough that he could pitch the story to us, propose it, and felt like there was probably enough there that it was going to turn into a story ultimately. What that will ultimately look like, he didn't know. He hadn't done all that reporting yet. But this was enough to get us to try and get us interested so that we could say, yes, commit your time to do this and not something else.
Yeah, so if we go up the chain, you say, let's get these into the pitch pool. Both are good. What are you saying there?
Alex is just one reporter. There, just in the Washington Bureau, there are 30 or 40 reporters pitching stories. We have to take all those stories, look through them, and decide which are the ones worth committing those reporters' time to, but also our resources to. We can't do everything everyone wants. It's like an initial vetting of ideas to narrow it down. And so there is actually a meeting that this is referencing. I think you heard Virginia Mosley talk about it yesterday, of some of the senior executives who would ultimately look through all of them and say, yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
If we could take that down and put up Defense Exhibit 72 in a limited manner. Thank you, Mr. DeMeza. And Mr. Levine, do you see this as an email between yourself and Virginia Mosley on top, and then an email that you sent on the bottom?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of DX 72.
No objection.
All right, Defense 72 submitted.
And may I publish?
You may.
Thank you. So, Mr. Levine, when a pitch gets made and a pitch moves through the process, do you know what the ultimate story is going to be?
No,
Why not?
because it takes reporting. And the reporting brings out new context, new angle, new information, and you're constantly recrafting what it is. So story can start here and end here. Sometimes it can start and end exactly what you thought it was going to be. It all just depends what the reporting brings back.
Okay. And so here on October 29th, You're sending this to Leora Capellas, do I have that right?
Apples.
Capellas. Michael Callahan and Virginia Mosley. And you write Marquardt pitches. And you say there's a growing market to evacuate desperate Afghans who are willing to pay in the wake of the vacuum left behind by the U.S. departure. Ads on Facebook promise to evacuate people for various sums to various places, $75K to Pakistan, $14K to UAE. We would interview an Afghan in the U.S. trying to get his family out, talk to others who are also trying to leave/work this shadowy black market, and attempt to contact some of the profiteers alleging to do the extractions, examine to what extent this is extortion of fraud. Did I read that correctly?
Think so.
Close enough, right?
Yeah.
My voice is going a little bit. What did you think of the concept of this story and the pitch?
I mean, I thought it was a really important story to tell. We'd been doing a lot about Afghanistan. It was a horrible situation. We'd spent a lot of time talking to veteran groups and others who've been trying to get people out. We had reporters in Kabul when the Taliban came in and took over. They were there. They were there at the airport when the airport, was taken over by the Taliban. They were near the airport, I believe, when that suicide bomber went out. So we've been covering this very closely. Our journalists were on the ground covering this and risking their own lives to tell this story. Back in Washington, this was an outgrowth of a decision by the Biden administration for how to get out of Afghanistan. So it was very important for us to cover all of those impacts. And this really, this story suggests that, desperate Afghans were coming up against even more hurdles than we considered. And Alex was going to show how this was going on and what was going on. I thought that was important.
And you see in the parentheses at the very end, I think this would appeal to the lead.
Yeah.
Why'd you write that?
Yeah, Jake Tapper's show, The Lead, they show a lot of interest in world news. Jake Tapper has a lot of interest in military matters. He's written books about Afghanistan. They're terrific. So I knew this would appeal to them. It's a subject they show a lot of interest in.
You use the term shadowy black market is used in this email that you send
Mhm.
along to Leora and Michael Callahan. Do you think that's an appropriate way to explain this market for extractions in Afghanistan?
I think so. The term black market, I know it's been bandied about this entire trial. Ultimately, we've heard what Afghanistan was at the time. It was totally lawless. General Young was up here, was talking about the Wild West. We've heard about people talking about bribes having to be given. I think Zach Young himself wrote in a LinkedIn, people were paying thousands in bribes just to get to the airport. That's not exactly a stable economy and market. That's a total breakdown of law, a total breakdown in the real world that we're used to and the way we move about. And this is what that outgrowth is, that people are having to go to things like LinkedIn and Facebook for people they don't even know to see if they could find someone who would help them. So I think it's a pretty apt description.
So if you take that down, so Mr. Levine, I assume, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that given your position, you're not in the weeds working on every story. You're more reviewing things when they get done. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, they'll consult with me at times. I'm pretty sure even this story, even before you saw that email, Alex probably ducked his head in and said, hey, what do you think about this? And I probably encouraged him to keep looking at it, and that's pretty common.
But in the period between the time the pitch is approved and when it kind of starts going to triad, what's your involvement?
I sometimes follow along. I think on this story, I was CC'd on all the scripting emails, but I tend to leave that for the editor, the triad, and the reporters to work out. I'll weigh in if I see something that concerns me or I have a thought for how they can make a story better, either in the storytelling or whether there needs to be a little more to be done for it that would make it a richer story. But in general, I'm letting the process happen.
So Mr. DeMazzo, if you could put up Defense Exhibit 109, which is in evidence. And before I ask you about this, you can do that. Thank you. This is you on November 10th at 17:05, which is 5:05. And you say, I think this is really good. Somewhere tag needs to explain this is different than the U.S. is helping directly get out. What do you mean by that?
When we're telling stories, you have to be cognizant of what the viewer reader is taking from it and what questions they might still have as they're reading it. And I thought as they saw Alex's story, it would be really important to emphasize, we're not talking about the people you saw get out on these government planes. This is a whole different class. And I just thought that was an emphasis you needed. I think Tom was talking about a fundamental question yesterday, and ultimately he couldn't get the answer out of the reporting, but he thought it was important that someone be reading this story would want to know if we had that answer, which is why he wanted that language added in. And you see that a lot, right? Sometimes you see we reached out to someone and they wouldn't comment. Why do we put that in if they didn't give us any information? Because the reader is going to want to know, did you try? And they, so you want to tell them what you know and what efforts you made. Some of that reporting is important to put into stories.
Would you draw a distinction based on this email between an Afghan who had to pay for their own evacuation and an Afghan who was evacuated with the assistance of the U.S. helping directly?
Yeah, I mean, I am. Absolutely.
You then say, obviously triad. Why'd you write that?
I just think this story clearly had a mix of things that would be of interest to triad, right? We're talking about where you're just, in general, there were figures, and that would be, fact checking. There were people who were going to appear in shadows, so we knew standards had to weigh in. We were talking about Mr. Young and his business, and we wanted to make sure that we were being fair and accurate in that, and they were going to want to see that to make sure, and that's something that both that legal standards and fact checking would probably want to see. So to me, it seemed pretty easy call to go to triad.
Not all stories go to triad?
No,
Do you trust the triad process?
I do.
Why?
I think what's come out in this trial is the care that's taken to make sure stories are right. I think having the triad is really important. These are independent arbiters on a story. They haven't been involved.
I'm Javi, and I got Botox Cosmetic. There was a particular photograph. The lines were so
Clear, and it is fair, and they do so. It's I think like sometimes in other industries they talk about red teaming things where you bring something to people that haven't been involved so they could question it and just try to shoot holes in it and make sure it's solid. And that's really what the triad is doing for us, and it's keeping our stories honest, that they're being properly reported and edited.
Okay, let me slow you down on one thing that you said. The triad is independent arbiters. They still work for CNN though, right?
They do.
Okay, well, how are they independent arbiters?
Well, they're independent from the story, right? They are not part of news gathering. Alex and all the people involved in the storytelling, like Katie Bowe, are all part of news gathering. And the triad are three independent groups, which you've heard about: legal and standards and fact checking, which we call the row. They don't report to the same people, but of course we're all part of CNN, but their interests are not making sure we choose stories. It's just they're there for the sole purpose of making sure the stories we do are fair and accurate.
You take that down, and Mr. Gomez, if you can put up plaintiff's exhibit 150, which is in evidence. And if you could go to page 2. Yeah. And if you could blow up that second email where Mr. Levine is on that. Not the one above, just the one above. Yep, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, I was kind of asking you, Mr. Levine, what you do and where your role is. And I think you may recall, we looked at this email maybe a couple times, where this is the process of Mr. Marquardt sending questions to Mr. Young after Mr. Young responds on November 11th. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you write, please share what you intend to send him before you send it. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why did you say that?
So we're in the middle of the story vetting process at this point. Alex, I believe, has written it. The triad has given back questions. Mr. Young has emerged on text, offering perhaps to talk to Alex. And I suspected, given we'd spent a week engaging with Mr. Young and trying to get Mr. Young to re-engage, that we probably only had one shot at this. And I wanted to make sure for the triad that they saw the questions, to make sure that if they had other questions, that those were asked at the same time. Because sometimes what happens is the reporter goes, gets information, then the triad has more questions. And it creates this whole loop. But you don't always have that opportunity. Sometimes you only get one shot at talking to a person for a story. So I just wanted to make sure it was as efficient as possible.
Did you want to be thoughtful about the questions that Mr. Marquardt asked?
Absolutely.
Now, we saw. If we
That's
go-
not to say his questions weren't thoughtful. I just thought we're in the middle of the process. If they had anything to add, they should.
You saw that Mr. Marquardt proposed 2 hours to have Mr. Young respond.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think in isolation, that would have been a tough ask. I think knowing, and I did know